Alrighty, welcome to the last lecture of U.S. History 2 for looking at the New Deal. And in case you're wondering about why the picture of Dinosaur Hill is featured, Dinosaur Hill in our hometown here was built during the New Deal period by the CCC. So just a little bit of history of the time period. Local. We've got the sections we're looking at in the textbook are 13.3, 13.4, and 13.5. Essentially the latter half of the New Deal Great Depression unit. We have a key terms list, and they're all listed in there. The goal of this little lecture is to kind of cover the following things and introduce them. We'll go into more detail as the unit progresses. But we're going to evaluate Hoover's approaches to resolving the Great Depression and how Americans reacted to it. We're going to contrast Hoover's approach with the economic crisis versus the following president, FDR. I'm going to introduce the idea behind the New Deal programs, and we'll look at them in more detail in class activities. We're also going to look at some of the major criticisms, and we're going to analyze how the New Deal has a long-term history as well. Alrighty, with those objectives outlined, let's dive into it. Just a spoiler alert, not everyone is too happy with how the government is handling things at the start of the Great Depression. Here's a picture of Herbert Hoover. He is the Republican president that is in office when the Great Depression kicks in. Essentially what happened is when the Great Depression broke out, Herbert Hoover was a practitioner of laissez-faire economics. Herbert Hoover and the Republicans, for the most part, believed that the economic system worked in a cycle. The corporations and the economy would expand, and then it would go through a period of contraction. And then it would expand, and expand again. This is not a popular thing because a lot of people felt that Herbert Hoover's cautious responses were not addressing the needs of the people. The tariff that we talked about in the Great Depression unit was an example of how he tried to intervene, and many people, especially people who came afterwards, feel that he did too little, too late, too slow. In any case, many Americans felt that Herbert Hoover was not addressing the problems of the American people. And so in the election of 1932, people began looking for new options on how to get the government involved in stopping the Great Depression. But some of the things that Herbert Hoover was disliked for, Hoovervilles, where many homeless people and jobless people lived. One of the big famous ones being in Central State Park, well, the entirety of Central State Park in New York. And other things like that made Herbert Hoover very unpopular. One of the theories that was very unpopular in this, and you're going to hear about it again in U.S. History 3, is something called supply side or trickle-down economics. In U.S. History 3, it's usually referred to with Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics. And essentially, this is kind of how the laissez-faire economics that the U.S. government practiced for this time period worked. Basically, businesses and top earners, so the wealthy, received tax breaks. The argument for this is the tax breaks allowed the businesses and top earners to increase investments. This, in turn, caused new investments to stimulate economic growth and provide jobs. This increase in employment raises consumer spending, because the more money you have, the more money you're going to spend. And this stimulates further economic growth because the United States is a consumer capitalist economy where buying stuff makes the economy go. Now, the thing that makes this laissez-faire is the U.S. government's only involved in this very top step. The only thing the government controls in trickle-down economics is the tax breaks. Essentially, by adjusting the levers of the tax breaks, or, well, putting them in and letting them go, the theory is that the private sector, individuals and corporations, will conduct themselves in a way that expands the economy and creates more work and creates more spending. And so this works as long as the private sector is fully functioning in this manner. However, the Great Depression really knocks a lot of this latter out. So, with the stock market crash, a lot of the businesses and top earners, they're not putting their money in investments because the economy's bad. And what a lot of people do when the economy's bad is they pull their money out, they pull out their investments, and they wait it out. And so what happens is the top earners are not investing. Well, since they're not investing, they're not creating economic growth, and they're not creating new jobs. So this leg of this portion falls out as well. And then this bottom part, as employment decreases, well, consumer spending decreases, which causes further depression. And so the problem with trickle-down economics is if these are knocked out, well, the whole system falls apart. But the government's still going to get blamed for it because the one portion that does work, no matter what's happening, is the tax breaks. The economy can crash, the economy can be fine, but at the end of the day, the government gets to decide what the tax rate is. And so many people would look at Herbert Hoover and these top earners and these businesses getting the tax breaks and say, what are you doing for us? The rest of us who depend on these steps. The private sector's dropping the ball. And so Herbert Hoover is widely seen as a failure. When he tries to explain that the economic cycle is on a downward stroke and it'll eventually go up, a lot of people are saying, well, when is it going to go up? Hoover did a few other things to really annoy people. Veterans March, World War I veterans marched on D.C. and they had to be broken up with tear gas and tanks. Really, by the time Herbert Hoover is reaching the end of his term, he's not going to get reelected. A lot of people don't like him. Especially in this time period, a lot of people begin questioning, is capitalism a good system? Because according to laissez-faire economics, according to trickle-down economics, prosperity should be, well, there. And so a lot of people begin looking at capitalism and questioning democracy and saying, you know what, maybe the system isn't working. And the thing that's kind of scary about this is there are other systems. The textbook points to the example of the Soviet Union and Soviet Union's collective farms and how the Soviet Union's building offers an alternative system, communism. Of course, our textbook, since it's a U.S. history, neglects to mention that the Russians were kind of in trouble at that time period, but, people are upset, and one of the big things about the Great Depression is a lot of Americans don't know what's going on necessarily outside the world, or they have a limited worldview, and so they know there's other systems out there other than democracy, but they really don't know as much about them. And obviously Soviet propaganda is going to put out one side of the story. But no matter what's going on, many people say we gotta change the system. The private sector is not fixing us. And so we need to fix the one lever of the system that still can be influenced without depending on the economy dragging itself up. And the people choose Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is running for office when 25% of the American people are unemployed. Amongst African Americans, it's 50-50. Soup kitchen lines wrap around New York City blocks. Homelessness is increasing. You saw the charts from last lecture. Businesses are dying. Banks are running. It's one of the darker points in American history that doesn't involve a war. And so many Americans felt that FDR was the promise. And so FDR and the Democratic Party offer an alternative to the Republican laissez-faire economic cycle. And this is the election of 1932 results. You'll notice that this is the Electoral College. Pretty much everyone votes blue, votes Democrat. These are the few states that carry the Republican, Hoover. It is worth noting, though, so this is considered a landslide victory. The Electoral College clearly chooses Roosevelt over Hoover. However, if you look at the popular vote, it's actually a lot closer than the 89 to 11%. It's a 57 to 40%. And this kind of tells you that while the Electoral College is more decisive in this case, the popular vote is more divided. What can we make of this? Well, it's considered a landslide victory in the history books, but the popular vote indicates it was not as close as people think. But the Electoral College does represent the more larger, longer-running trends in U.S. governmental elections. So it's just kind of an interesting thing I like to look at. The big thing you need to know is FDR runs on a ticket saying, we're going to change things, we're going to change things for the better, give me the power to do so. In fact, if you hear his inaugural speech, he basically explains that the Great Depression is like a war, and the United States needs the exact same powers as a country fighting a war. That is the language he uses. And so his New Deal, which he doesn't go into much detail while he's campaigning, is all about giving the government the power to fight the Great Depression as if it were a war. And if you remember from our World War I unit, or if you remember from U.S. History 1 in the Civil War, when the going gets tough, the United States government seizes a lot of power to try and organize things and tries to fix things. The level of success is always up for debate in the historical sense, but let's take a look at the New Deal. So, this is an example of a New Deal program, probably CCC, maybe WPA. I don't remember what the label says. But essentially, once Roosevelt's elected, he has the 100 days. And within the 100 days, he passes 15 major bills. The Democrats control the House, they control the Senate, and Roosevelt, as the president, Congress can move with ruthless efficiency, and Roosevelt introduces a ton of new bills to try and mobilize the government to fight the Great Depression. But in case you're wondering, when you get to U.S. government, the 100 days this is where that mythos of the 100 days of the presidency comes into play. It's mentioned every time a president is elected. What can they do in their first 100 days? Because Roosevelt got 15 bills through and really changed a lot of things. So there's a reference for U.S. government in case you need it. Now, what Roosevelt was proposing was something called the New Deal. The New Deal's goal was to combat the Great Depression and set up an America that would not suffer the Great Depression again. And so there's three ideas that the Great Depression programs have goals for. One of the goals is relief, fix the immediate problems. What's hurting the American people right now, and how can the U.S. government fix it? We've got recovery. What can we do to fix things for the long game? What can we fix so that the next generation and the generation that follows do not suffer the long-term effects? Because like with the Great Depression, you can tell when people lived during the Great Depression. Malnutrition was very common. There were a lot of health problems associated with the Dust Bowl. And so recovery was looking at the long run. How do we fix things for the long game? And then the last one is reform. How do we prevent the Great Depression from ever happening again? The reform portion is probably the part that you're going to hear most about. You may not care about it now while you're young, but when you're older, there's a few things that play a big role, such as Social Security. But we'll talk about that in a second. So to sum that up, relief, recovery, and reform. Fix it now, fix it for the long run, make it so it never happens again. Everything that the New Deal does a combination of one of these three. So, some of the things the New Deal is going to try and do is restore the nation's confidence, because remember what's driving the economy? What drove the stock prices up in the 1920s? Confidence. Americans believe that if I put my money into this, it will succeed and I will profit. In order to restore confidence, one of the things they did is fix the finance system. Maybe people shouldn't be able to take out dangerous loans to invest money in. Maybe banks need to be set up so that they don't run out of money because of poor practices or dangerous loan giving. Maybe there needs to be some watchdog service looking at the stock market, things like that. We're also going to see reforms in agriculture, which is really important to our home state. And these two things I'll get to in a little bit. Now, one of the other things that's really important about FDR is FDR not only is creating these new programs and the government is implementing these new programs, he needs to explain these programs. And so what we get is something called the fireside chats. Before this time period, people didn't really hear directly from the American president. And what FDR did is he would go on the radio and explain programs, talk about what the U.S. government was doing to address the American people. And they're referred to as fireside chats because they kind of felt like you and a few of your buddies, it's the end of the day, you're sitting by the fireplace, just having a conversation, man to man, person to person, a meaningful face-to-face conversation. FDR spoke in a manner that kind of said, look, this is what we're doing, this is what's working, things like that. The goal was sell the American people, restore their confidence, and help them realize that the government is there for them. That is the goal. One of the goals of FDR's New Deal is encourage and explain. Now, I couldn't figure out where to fit this better, and apparently neither could the textbook, but one of the examples of the programs that the New Deal has is something called the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. And it's one of those programs, it covers relief and recovery, mostly recovery. The problem with the Tennessee Valley is, while it's fairly good farmland, it's very good farmland, there's not a lot of electricity here. And there's a problem that it's flooding. So while we're having a dust bowl over this way, we're actually having flooding problems over here. And if it isn't flooding, it's drought, and it's a mess. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority was put together as a government program to basically dam up the Tennessee Valley, essentially building dams and putting in power plants. And the idea is the dams would control the water flow. They would prevent flooding, and during drought seasons, they release water to make sure that farming continued. The hydroelectric plants would introduce electricity. Part of the reason of bringing in electricity is in the 1920s, we talk about the electricity and how people are buying electronic goods. That's not happening in the countryside. Most Americans don't have electricity. The big cities do, the growing cities do, but in the countryside, they don't. And so introducing electricity into this area, in addition to water control, creates an environment where Americans in this area will not only have better farming, but maybe someday they'll start buying electronic goods and that'll improve the economy. So, something to consider. So this is kind of an example of the U.S. government. The U.S. government comes in and builds these dams. They hire the people, they organize it, they have the architects design it. The U.S. government oversees this big project, and it's called the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. But let's take a look at some of these programs, because the New Deal is a catch-all net for a whole bunch of programs that are going on. These are just some of them. We're going to look at them in way more detail, but I just want to take a moment and cover some of the big ones. So, we're not going to cover everything in this chart. I just want to cover the big ones that we like to test on and that people kind of like, you need to know this stuff. So, the big one that everyone thinks about nowadays is the Social Security Act of 1935. You just can think of it as Social Security. And the idea was it's a pension system and unemployment insurance. Essentially what happens is every paycheck certain amount of money is taken out and put into Social Security. When you retire, you get, after you reach a certain age, you can collect from Social Security, and you get checks in the mail to help you with your life after retirement. This is one of those long-term impacting things, because the goal of Social Security is, in the olden days, your retirement plan was, well, if you didn't die while you were working, your family took care of you. And what we discovered during the Great Depression is a lot of families didn't have the resources to, well, do that. And older people aren't necessarily the best considered very hireable. A lot of companies would probably prefer hiring young people. You still see this issue to this day with a lot of things. And so that's what Social Security does, still, even to this day. There's a video on it further down that I recommend you watch on your own time or after this lecture, and I'll post the link to this lecture in the description below. No. Another program that's worth noting is the WPA. The WPA is one of those programs. It's a lot like the CCC. It just comes later. But essentially what they did is the goal of the WPA and, well, the CCC like it, their goal, these two programs, was get young men back to work. So men specifically between like ages 18, 25 or so, they were hired to do government projects. A lot of these projects are building roads. They're building infrastructure, schools. They send a lot of them into the national parks. They planted trees to help prevent erosion from the Dust Bowl. The WPA also hired artists. If you ever go to a national park, you'll find a lot of WPA reprints of different works of art. They hired artists to make art and sell it. The goal of these kind of programs, the CCC and the WPA, is get people back to work. A portion of their wage gets sent home. They keep a portion. It gets them back to work. It's not a long-term solution, but in the end of the day, we get a bunch of nice roads out of it and other things. There is one CCC program I want to mention. It's not talked about in your textbook. It's local regional history, but that's Dinosaur Hill. Essentially, in our hometown, we have a bunch of concrete dinosaurs that watch over the city. Essentially, somebody convinced the CCC that, hey, we should make a tourist attraction for this relatively small town in the Dakotas. What we'll do is we'll hire this artist who's really good at making dinosaurs to design some dinosaurs. Then we'll have the CCC build these dinosaurs, put in a gift shop, sell some merch, and tourism. So I like to tell this one because it's a long-winded lead into, to fight the Great Depression, we even brought in dinosaurs. Anyways, I'm not going to cover all these programs, but another one of the big ones is the Rural Electrification Administration. As I told you before, with the TVA, a lot of places didn't get electricity because in big cities, you have a lot of people buying electricity. On the countryside, you might have a electrical line go out and it powers one house. Power companies don't care about one house. But with the Rural Electrification Administration, it created financial incentives to encourage power companies to extend their lines out into the farms. Let's see here. Another program that's worth mentioning. I'll mention them together, but like the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards, the goal of these ones were to make sure that working conditions didn't slip back to their old school industrial revolution era stuff. Part of the reason of this is concern of communism. Remember when I told you a lot of people are considering alternatives? Well, the New Deal still has to worry about the concern of a communist revolution. If you ever hear about Soviet propaganda in this time period, the global revolution is a thing that they talk about an awful lot. And capitalism is one of the enemies of communism. So these kind of things are designed to make it so that the working class and labor unions side with the U.S. government and not slip into communism. Another program that's worth mentioning, one more, is the FDIC, which came out of the Banking Act of 1935. The FDIC insures bank deposits. So when you put your money into a bank nowadays, if something happens to that bank, the FDIC insures your money up to a certain amount. You don't lose your money in the bank. And the idea behind this is create a sense of security. Banks need money to make loans, and those loans help start businesses and allow Americans to do things that they can't do with the money they currently have. Business owners need loans. Very few people have all the resources they need to start a business by themselves. And so, or people need to buy houses, or they need to buy cars. And so the FDIC ensures that, tells people that, hey, the bank is a safe place to keep money. Because if it's approved by the FDIC, that means they're doing things that aren't stupid that helped cause the Great Depression. So that's the last one I wanted to cover. We'll go into more detail about a lot of programs later, but those are the ones I wanted to talk about right now. But one of the big impacts you need to get out of this is the New Deal legislation creates a new role for the government. But no. So FDR is going to do a lot of things. He's actually going to have a second New Deal, which we saw some programs detailed up here. Even though there are two New Deals, the way we study it in U.S. history too, due to the very limited time constraints, we focus on the New Deal as kind of an all-encompassing thing, including both portions of it. But there is a first one, there's a second one. Another big one that's important is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The idea of this was to fix the farming problems. We will talk about this more in class. We'll work on it in class activities. But essentially, the Agricultural Adjustment Act's goal is make it so that the farmers aren't losing money and going out of business like crazy. And that comes through changing how farmers operate. You can see the Rural Electrification Administration is succeeding, going by these lines. Now I want to talk about the critics of the New Deal. The critics of the New Deal actually cover the whole political spectrum. So Roosevelt often, while he had Congress's support, there were a lot of Americans who opposed the New Deal. The three groups we're going to look at are going to be on the political spectrum and the Supreme Court. So first let's talk about the political spectrum. So the New Deal is a kind of social program. It's socialist. But if you're a communist or further left-leaning than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you think the New Deal doesn't go far enough. Why are we trying to incentivize private corporations to have confidence? Why is the FDIC insuring banks that aren't controlled by the government? The left, the political left, says, why are we doing these things? Why doesn't the government just take control of everything? The communists look at the New Deal and say it's too weak, it doesn't go far enough, it's not radical enough. We have a chance to change the world. Why don't we make the New Deal go further? And so that's the complaints on the left, is the New Deal is weak sauce. That's a dead meme. Anyways, on the right, so with Republicans and other conservatives, they look at the New Deal with horror. They look at it and say, look at this. This is going too far. The government is reaching in and messing with things. It's doing things the government's never done before. It's taking more and more power. They look at it and they say, this is too much. This is too far. The New Deal is a problem. But FDR's critics were not enough to really overcome him, and he runs for presidency in 1936, and, well, he wins. He is the longest running president. Some other critics of the New Deal start looking at the New Deal and saying, wait a second, is this actually working? So this political cartoon kind of illustrates it, because what the New Deal did is it increased taxes, especially on the rich. And while all this money is being spent, the problem with the CCC is they're building roads, but people can't afford cars to drive on those roads. the men who work on the CCC jobs, those jobs are temporary. And the only reason they're paid is because some taxpayers are paying them. And so there's a lot of problems with the New Deal. For all the efforts of the farmers and the New Deal people trying to plant trees and fix erosion, it's helping, but the drought continues, the Dust Bowl continues. And there's many problems that are still arising. The New Deal isn't quite fixing the Great Depression. It's going to set things up for a long game, but the problem is most people aren't going to be alive long enough to see it through, or at least they don't feel like it. Anyways, FDR holds the election, as I told you before, 61 to 37. Takes every state except for Maine and Vermont. But, however, a new opponent emerges from the New Deal, against the New Deal, and that's the Supreme Court. What happens is the Supreme Court was mainly built up in previous administrations, mostly by Republican candidates. And so many of the Supreme Court members were conservatives. And one of the ways that they slowed the New Deal down was by declaring different bills unconstitutional. Like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which we'll talk about in class, it was deemed unconstitutional when it was first put out. The Supreme Court would essentially look at this, and their interpretation was kind of the laissez-faire model. They said, look, the government's getting too far involved in things, and we feel that we can't let that continue. And so while Congress was passing bills and FDR was signing bills, this U.S. Supreme Court was trying to put on the brakes and say, let's slow this down. We don't think this is the appropriate approach. So, Roosevelt didn't appreciate this, and what he tried to do was decrease the effectiveness of the Supreme Court. It's a key term. It's something called court packing. Essentially what FDR argued is the 9 Supreme Court justices, they're appointed for life, and that's a tough job. Maybe they need new, younger justices to help them out with making decisions. Maybe we need to increase the size of the Supreme Court. And the goal of this is the president appoints all Supreme Court appointees. Congress approves of all Supreme Court appointees. FDR could essentially increase the number of Supreme Court justices, distort the vote, and guarantee that the Supreme Court would never be a threat to him again, because he would just appoint enough justices to guarantee that the Supreme Court would not be able to effectively question his judgment. Now, Congress freaked out about this and blocked Roosevelt from doing this, because essentially they said, that goes too far. If we get rid of the balance and checks, you'll hear about that in government, if we weaken the Supreme Court and get rid of it, we're destroying a key aspect of the American democracy. And so court packing doesn't work out. And the Supreme Court will continue to be oppositional, but its justices, they age out and die, and so new ones are appointed. So FDR, he tries many things. He's well thought of in the history books, but at one point he did decide that the Supreme Court was a threat and needed to be destroyed. A bit of a fascist move. If you ever study the communist propaganda, they have some fun things to say about FDR. Anyways, in the grand scheme of things, what the New Deal does is it doesn't end the Great Depression. Historians widely agree that what ends the Great Depression is World War II. Essentially, Herbert Hoover wasn't wrong. The U.S. went through an economic cycle. The 1920s was unprecedented growth. That wasn't sustainable. And then it consolidated down during the Great Depression. And then when World War II broke out, the United States expanded dramatically again, a more sustainable growth model. Essentially what happened is America needed to feed the world. America needed to arm the world. And that's what gets Americans back to work. That's what gets the American economy out of the Great Depression. What ends the Dust Bowl is rain. That's not to say that the New Deal programs don't prevent it, because we've had worse droughts than the Great Depression's Dust Bowl drought. The only difference is we have better farming practices. So that's not to dismiss the New Deal completely. It's just to point out that the New Deal doesn't end the Great Depression. However, the lasting legacy of the New Deal is it expanded the federal government dramatically. Essentially, you can read the quote here in the text, but essentially what the U.S. government does is it basically says, look, if you're going to blame us for all these problems, if you're going to ask us for help, we are going to take the power to do it. And so the federal government is going to have an increased presence in the average American's life. And this is a trend that has continued to this day. When the going gets tough, the American people ask, so what is the plan, Fed? So, is it good? Is it bad? Well, there's some programs that come out of the New Deal, like Social Security is now widely accepted. Republicans and Democrats agree, Social Security is important. And so there's a lot of aspects of the New Deal that they're no longer questions of conservative versus liberal arguments. So the New Deal has a lasting historical legacy. At the time, it didn't fix the Great Depression, but in the long run, it's changed America dramatically. The America before the New Deal is radically different from the America after the New Deal. But I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope this lecture series is helpful. I originally created it in fall 2019. It'll be usable at least through spring 2020, possibly longer than that. It doesn't look like we're going to be changing the curriculum too much. I may add more videos to different subsections as we go along, but at this point, I don't think I'll be doing huge dramatic changes in things. This goal, this unit of these lectures is to introduce a topic. If you're curious about my next project, for spring 2020, I'm going to be releasing a series of ancient civilization lecture videos. They should hopefully be a bit more interesting than these ones, because, well, it's ancient civ, and a lot of people find that subject fun. But I guess all things said, until later.